I've seen so many landlords leave so much cash on the table because they didn't know how to carry out a commercial rent review correctly. I've seen tenants get screwed on commercial rent reviews because they didn't understand the process and the landlord did. If you're a commercial landlord or a commercial tenant, or you have aspirations or plans to be a landlord or commercial landlord or investor in the future, or perhaps you want to run your own business and you may need to rent some space in the future, even if it's a coffee shop or an office block, this video could save your business or dramatically increase your investment if you're a landlord. I've been involved in lots of rent reviews, acting on both landlords and tenants. On the client side of landlords, sometimes we've been successfully able to increase rents dramatically, as high as 350% in commercial rent reviews. That increase is not just an increase in rent for the landlord and our client of 350%, it also is an increase in value of that underlying asset, perhaps as much as 300%. That increase in property value all came about by some paperwork. Granted, it took months of negotiation to get those increases, and in some cases we've had to go to arbitration and third party. I've seen investor clients buy properties that are undervalued because they know the commercial rent review hasn't been taken care of correctly, and they've been able to acquire properties that are undervalued. I've seen landlords who have been ill-advised and not completing rent reviews and have sold properties and have left a lot of money on the table. Savvy investors understand that commercial rent reviews can double property value in some cases if applied correctly. And good investors understand that not all landlords understand the rent review process. It's not just savvy investors that can take advantage of the rent review process. Tenants that understand the process and understand their lease can make it work in their favor. I've successfully been able to negotiate some rent reductions for some commercial tenants. Also, where rent reductions aren't possible, perhaps because the market value of the property is far higher, I've been able to successfully achieve 10 to 20% below the market rate for some tenants because I've used the lease and the rent review clauses within that lease against the landlord to be able to negotiate better terms. So how do you make a rent review work in your favor if you're a landlord or a tenant? First thing, you need to understand the importance of a lease. If you are an investor or a landlord, the lease underpins the value of a commercial property. A lease could make a property twice as valuable as the adjoining property, even if they're the exact same property. And to the same extent, a poorly written or poorly drafted lease could undervalue or cause a property to be undervalued. I prepared a presentation some time ago on the importance of lease negotiations within commercial leases. But nearly everything within this presentation on commercial leases applies to the rent review process. And I just want to take you through this presentation. I'm not going to touch on everything that's in the presentation, but touch on some of the elements that are very important for a rent review. So this is the presentation that I prepared. I'll quickly flick through this quickly. In terms of lease types, it is slightly important to understand that there are a few different types of leases. Mainly there are leases and licenses. Leases give you generally full control over the property, subject to some conditions within the lease that the landlord has over the property. A license generally means that the landlord still maintains kind of access and a lot of control in regards to that property and what you use the property for. In terms of leases, most commercial leases in Ireland are going to be between kind of 5 and 25 years. There is a thing called a 4-year 9-month lease. I don't like them. They shouldn't be used anymore. I don't know why they're continually rolled out, because there is a new thing, or a thing called a deed of renunciation, which should have wiped out 4-year 9 leases a long time ago, but we still keep seeing them all the time. This was the contents of the presentation: negotiations, lease negotiation, additional costs associated with taking on a commercial lease, lease clauses, what's important within a lease clause. A lot of that is going to be very important in terms of rent review time. The rent review clause is vitally important, and the use or planning permission around a property also impacts the rent review as well. But moving on swiftly. Okay, so the first thing is location. We all know location is vitally important for property. A lot of rent reviews are going to be negotiated based on the fact of the market and the market within that surrounding area or that location. So therefore, it's vitally important to understand the location and the market you're doing your rent review in, or where the property applies to. So the area, what transport links, what footfall, depending on the use of the property. Is footfall going to be vitally important to it? Is car parking going to be vitally important to the use of that property? If there's no car parking, how do people get to work, etc.? All that kind of stuff. Future development within the area, is it going to impact the use of the property long term, particularly if you're talking about a lease that's 25 years? Is the surrounding area offices or residential? That will impact the use depending on what you're trying to do. If you're a commercial tenant and you are a coffee shop, are you better off being near, are you making more money if you're near offices or near residential? Things have been changing over the last few years. Who are the competitors in the market as well? Who's near you? If you are a fast food operator, is there other fast food operators located near you? If they are near you, perhaps they're not in the market for a new lease when it comes to rent review, so they can be discounted, and therefore it will impact the rent that is achievable on the property. So these are all vital things to consider when it comes to rent review as well. Business hours are also going to be important. If you're in a mixed use scheme, and what you're allowed to do during certain hours. Perhaps you're a gym and most of your clients come early in the morning or in the evening, but if you're restricted in terms of your hours that you're allowed use, that could impact at rent review time. As well as if you're a coffee shop and perhaps you want to start serving people at 8 o'clock, but for whatever reason people can't get in beyond the gate certain times until 9 o'clock. All these little things can impact the location that you pick, but also can impact your rent review down the line as well. Lease negotiation is vitally important at the very start of a lease before you sign it. A lot of tenants just focus on the money element of it in terms of what their headline rent is or how much it's going to cost them per year, and they neglect all the other clauses in it. And a landlord is not going to neglect things like break options, personal guarantees, the rent review clause. They're all going to be front of mind for the landlord, and tenants need to up their game in terms of the negotiation. Understand what's important to you as a tenant and understand what's important to the landlord, and try and negotiate your best deal from there. And it's always important to think about the rent review, because in 5 years time, perhaps you got a good deal when you walked in, but in 5 years time you could get a rent increase that could put you out of business. Additional cost is so important. A lot of people think about this at the start when they're signing a lease, but they forget about it when it comes to rent review. It's important to realise that if you are in a building that has higher than average service charge costs, or higher than average insurance costs, or the general costs for fit out, etc., are all higher based on similar neighbouring buildings, perhaps there's an argument as a tenant that you can negotiate your rent or your headline rent down a little bit come year 5 based on the market. Vice versa, if you're a landlord and your service charge is very low in that building and your insurance is very low compared to the market, perhaps there's a good reason for you to ask for a slightly higher than market rent. It's vitally important that both landlord and tenant understand the lease. On average, leases are about 40 to 50 pages. Some of them can be up to about 100 pages. And I have seen the odd lease for shopping centres, for large shopping centres, up to about 300 pages. There's a lot in there. There's a lot of clauses that landlords and tenants need to understand how they could impact a rent review. A repair clause could impact a rent review. Perhaps a repair clause is over stringent on a tenant, and therefore it could be difficult to release the unit based on that clause in the current market. Perhaps the use is restrictive. That could also impact the rent review. Break options are a big thing. Depending on the actual term of the lease, break options could impact the rent review as well. Service charge clauses, if they're too stringent, or alienation clauses, etc. All of these things need to be borne in mind. Was there a deed of renunciation signed at the start or not? If there was none signed at the start, that's quite a valuable thing for a tenant to have, and therefore a landlord could argue that the rent that they're paying they should be paying a premium for not having to sign a deed of renunciation. So there's lots of things within leases that can be used as pros and cons depending on what way you're arguing, if you're arguing for a landlord or a tenant. And it's vitally important that people who are doing rent reviews understand that, because it's not just about the market rent. The lease itself also plays a big factor. So as I said at the start, I put this presentation together to discuss the importance of lease negotiations within commercial leases, not about rent reviews. But I had this slide solely on rent reviews, and up at the very top it was make or break. So a rent review clause can make or break your business or make or break your investment depending on what way you've structured it. Generally speaking, most leases, commercial leases, might be over 5 years. If they're over 5 years, it's very common to have a rent review clause at year 5. It can be reviewed to open market, CPI, or there can be fixed uplifts. Open market rent reviews in Ireland can be upwards or downwards, so therefore every 5 years there is an opportunity to review the rent, and if the market has fallen, there is an opportunity there to review the rent down for a tenant. Some leases can be structured in such a way that the landlord is the only person who can trigger that rent review. That is a landlord trying to get away from the downward rent review option that a tenant might have. But again, it's important for a tenant to understand why such a clause might be in a lease and be very strong to negotiate that out at the very start. Generally speaking, rent reviews are agreed by negotiation. If parties can't agree, it goes to third party arbitration. It can be a long drawn out process, and definitely if it goes to arbitration, you will need an expert in your corner fighting for you. Dues stated within the lease, as well as what the building has planning permission for, can have a big impact in terms of rent review. Both landlords and tenants need to be aware of that. Some common mistakes that tenants make when they are leasing properties that can also apply to rent reviews. I would say if you are a tenant and some of these mistakes are familiar to you and you want to try and negotiate them out, rent review time is an opportunity to try and negotiate some of these mistakes out. Landlord doesn't have to entertain you, but at least it's a good time to open dialogue. One is user clause. A lot of cases, tenants believe that they have an exclusive right for a particular use within perhaps a shopping centre. Perhaps there are barbers. It says the only thing they can do is they can operate as a barber and nothing else. Therefore, they think that they are the only people who are allowed to operate as a barber. A lot of the time, this is a tenant-only clause, and it means that the landlord can do whatever they want. They can put in 10 barber shops if they want, because it's tenant-only. If there is a clause that restricts the landlord from allowing any other particular use or allowing any other barbershop within that shopping centre or development, that would be a restrictive clause on the landlord, which technically could be a valuable asset for the tenant and a valuable asset that the tenant would pay for and pay a slightly higher rent for. So it's important come rent reviews time that landlords know that they are valuable assets if there is a restrictive clause on them, and tenant also needs to be aware that it is going to hurt them come rent review. Opening hours and perhaps even car park opening hours can cause big impacts for tenants when they don't realise it when they're signing leases. Perhaps if you are an office development and traditionally the office development opened at 9 or opened at 8, closed at like 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever it was, that may not suit some more modern tech companies, and these tech companies go into the development not realising that the car park closes at 8 o'clock, but they have no control over the car park and their cars get locked into the car park every single night because they're working US hours, etc., and it can cause major issues for offices if they don't understand opening hours. Another element that can affect rent reviews is going to be yield up clauses or fit out at rent review. These are kind of things that you need to document in terms of what the tenant is responsible for to make sure you don't get hit twice. All I would say is rent reviews can make an investment or they can break tenants' businesses. I've seen lots of landlords leave lots of money on the table, as I said, because they don't understand the rent review process. I've seen commercial tenants be put out of business or their business be at risk because rents have gone up dramatically and they haven't been properly advised around rent reviews. It's important to realise that it's not uncommon for rents to increase by nearly 100% in a 5-year period in some markets, and therefore tenants have to be aware of that and need to be advised correctly on that. My advice is do not underestimate the value of good advice come rent review time. If you're a landlord or a tenant, they only happen every 5 years and your rent is locked in for 5 years, and it's so important you get the right advice at the right time. If you ever need any advice on any of these types of topics, email details are below. Also, there's a few links for you to sign up for our newsletter, etc. Show your support for the channel by hitting that like button. I'm Shane Fleming and thank you very much for watching.